Welcome, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar for the launch of the Tropical Forest Alliance Collective Action Agenda. We're extremely excited to be at this point where we can share this important work with all of you. And we anticipate well over a couple hundred partners and colleagues joining this webinar. So I know people are signing on here as I speak, but we want to get started so that we can make sure we have good opportunity for both the information we'd like to share and the discussion questions that we'd like to field from all of you as you see this information. Just a few words about the webinar itself. It is being recorded. As you'll notice, as you join us, you will be muted, and there's no video of participants. You will be seeing some slides, and you'll be seeing video of those who are making presentations as we go through the webinar today. If you are unable for some reason to get on through your computer or run into a technical problem, there is a phone-in dial option, but we would ask you that to only use that if absolutely necessary, just to keep background noise, etc., and make sure you have the best possible connection. We are also very pleased that Matthias Weitbrecht will be doing graphic recording during portions of the webinar today, and will be sharing his artwork with you at a couple points during the webinar, and we just thought that would be an additional way to make sure we're capturing the good discussion, good information that we're all going to be sharing today. This webinar has several objectives associated with it. First, of course, it is to introduce the Tropical Forest Alliance Collective Action Agenda, and I say TFA Collective Action Agenda, but it's really a collective action agenda for all of us in the entire community to work together. And TFA is taken a lead role in coalescing these ideas and providing a structure. But this is a product that needs to be owned by and pushed forward and enlivened and energized by the entire TFA community. We're going to provide a sampling of the kinds of actions that we are hoping will come to life through the collective action agenda. And we've asked a number of colleagues who I'll introduce to you in a second to share their ideas about how the collective action agenda is going to benefit their work. And most importantly, catalyze and support the actions of the private sector to remove tropical deforestation from commodity supply chains, which is at the heart of TFA's mission and at the heart of the collective action agenda. We'll also, through this web interface, have the opportunity for you to make comments or questions throughout. You'll see a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, hopefully. We encourage you to ask questions, pose questions, or make comments and suggestions throughout. And again, we'll curate those questions, and I'll have time, hopefully, to pose some of the more common issues that are arising back to our participants or to the TFA Secretariat so we can respond. We will also keep a complete record of those comments and questions, which we'll share back with the community, and we'll answer any questions that we don't have a chance to respond to in live action. Before I introduce through a slide our speakers for today and turn it over to WRI, I just want to quickly go over the agenda. Our first item will be to hear information about the action being taken, the data work that WRI has been doing. Then we'll hear information from Justin Adams about the structure and content of the CAA. And then we'll be hearing from CGF regarding the really good work they've been doing on the Coalition of Action and the Palm Oil Roadmap. And then a comment from our trader colleague, Wei Peng, and then we'll have an opportunity for some discussion and Q&A. And then similarly, you can see we'll run through the other sectors. So our speakers today are the following. I'm not going to introduce them right now. You can see them on your slide. And again, we really want to thank them for taking the time to join us. Before we get started with WRI, I just wanted to say a word about the global situation. We're obviously in the TFA family well aware of the extreme crisis that our world is experiencing right now with COVID-19. We know that focusing on the issues that we're talking about today, to some degree, may seem less important in that context, and we want to honor and acknowledge that. At the same time, I think we all who participate in the TFA community understand that we need to be able to keep pushing forward with this important work, even in the context in which we're all suffering in so many ways right now. I also want to thank all of you for taking time out of your busy lives, with many of which I'm sure have other things to worry about, to join us today. So we just wanted to be clear that we understand the context in which we're proceeding today. With that, I'd like to turn the podium, so to speak, over to our colleagues from the World Resources Institute, Liz Goldman and Michaela Weiss. And I think Michaela is going to lead off with an overview of the global trends work they've been doing related to tropical deforestation caused by commodity supply chains. Michaela?
Great, thanks so much, John. So today I'm going to give a bit of an overview of some work that we've been doing, as John said, trying to link deforestation to particular commodities at a global level. This work is still preliminary, but we are working on a peer review and publication for it. So we'll provide some more details at the end of this if anyone would like to provide further feedback. You can go to the next slide, please. So you may have seen some of this work before. In 2018, Global Forest Watch and the Sustainability Consortium published this piece in Science linking tree cover loss to its dominant drivers, over half of which, or around half of which, is actually for agriculture. There were 166 million hectares of tree cover loss that were linked to agriculture between 2001 and 2018. And as you can see in this graph, that has actually increased over time. We noted a bit of a spike in 2016 and 2017. That was mostly related to fires, agricultural related fires in Brazil. But even in 2018, we're still at the fourth highest that it's ever been, and higher than any year prior to 2014. So this is still definitely a very pressing issue, and one that we haven't been able to make as much progress on at the global level as I think many of us would have liked. And so a lot of this work is to try and drill down into these numbers. You know, this analysis is quite coarse, and try and say something about the particular forest risk commodities and how much each of them are contributing to deforestation. You can go to the next slide, please. So this is an overview of our results. We looked at the four main forest risk commodities: cattle, oil palm, soy, and wood fiber, as well as cocoa, coffee, and rubber. And as you can see in this graph, cattle by far and away had the most forest replacements in the time period from 2001 to 2015. It was more than double all of the rest of the commodities combined. That was followed by oil palm and by soy, and then the other commodities each contributing around 2 million hectares of deforestation over the time period. I've also indicated in this chart what's been happening in the past couple of years. So you can see that some of the commodities, we've actually seen a bit of a downward trend in the last few years, and Liz is going to go through some of the specific results for those commodities. You'll also note that some of these bars in the graph on the left have preliminary on them. You know, we're not actually showing results. And then if you go to the next slide. It's because we're worried about a couple of things with lag time. So first of all, we know that for some of these crops, for some of these commodities, actually the time between when the deforestation happens and when that commodity is planted in a normal cycle may be a couple of years. And so, you know, if soy is intercropped with corn, for example, if something's deforested in 2018, we might not actually see soy on that land until a couple of years later. At the same time, we're mostly using satellite-based information to do this assessment. And so some of these commodities like oil palm, we actually can't see until they're a bit older, so a couple years into the growing cycle. And so just as a word of warning that when you see these preliminary results on the slide, you know, we're not fully confident yet that those are fully representative of the trend. And I have just a table here to show the last year where we feel really confident. We are showing later years just to give you a sense, and because we've had a lot of questions about this, but definitely take those with a grain of salt. So with that, I'll pass it over to Liz to give us a bit more detail about some of the specific commodities.
Great, thanks, Michaela. So the next few slides will just show a few excerpts from our larger study, but starting with our palm oil results, we combined spatially explicit oil palm plantation boundaries to analyze the expansion of oil palm from 2001 to 2018. And we found that oil palms replaced 11.3 million hectares of forest globally from 2001 to 2015. The time series on the left breaks the loss down by primary and secondary forests, and we see that about a third of loss occurred on land that was previously primary forest. And we can see that there are peaks in 2009 and 2012, and these also correspond to crude palm oil price increases. Post-2012, the downward trend from 2013 to 2015 matches findings from other studies in the literature, which cite declining crude palm oil prices, Indonesia's forest moratorium, and zero deforestation commitments as possible explanations for this decline. And then, as Michaela described, we did include some preliminary numbers for 2016 to 2018, but again, due to these lag issues, they will certainly go up as we get additional years of lost data. The map on the right shows results, oh, you can go back. The map on the right shows results by district in Indonesia and Malaysia. And we divided total forest replaced by oil palm by total land area to try to normalize the data. But basically, dark brown areas show where there's higher concentrations of forest replaced by oil palm. And as you can see, parts of Sumatra, Peninsular Malaysia, West Kalimantan, and Sarawak had particularly high concentrations of loss. Next slide, please. 8.2 million hectares of forest were replaced by soy from 2001 to 2015 globally. Focusing in on South America, where 97% of global forest loss by soy occurred, and where we can analyze 30-meter resolution annual soy data from the University of Maryland, we see municipalities which have high concentrations of loss in Brazil, Argentina, Bolivia, and Paraguay. And the trend line on the right breaks down the results by country and shows that the majority of forest replaced by soy were in Brazil. And the overall trend line does actually match the results from all of Brazil if we were to look at all of the loss within the country. So there's a peak in 2004 and then a steady decline through 2015. And then just as with oil palm, there's this lag issue with soy production as well. So we see that there are land transitions with pasture and also delays in planting. And so the results from 2016 to 2018 are still preliminary for now. And again, will definitely increase with more lost data. Next slide. If we dig into Brazil just a bit more, we also have results by Brazilian biome. And we can see that the total loss dropped for all biomes after 2004, but that actually a higher proportion of loss started to occur in the Cerrado as we move through the time series. The drop in 2005 coincides with a 2004 federal plan to reduce deforestation rates in the Brazilian Amazon, a dip in profitability of soybeans from 2005 to 2007, and the 2006 industry-led soy moratorium. Next slide, moving on to cattle, 52.5 million hectares of forest were replaced by pasture globally between 2001 and 2015, and about 42% of loss occurred in Brazil. So again, drilling down into Brazil further, next slide, we can look at biomes and see that 70% of this loss occurred in the Amazon and 20% occurred in the Cerrado. And we know that motives for converting forest to pasture include a lot of different intersecting factors. The literature tells us that forest expansion occurs despite very low or even negative profit margins for ranching. But in addition to any of these potential profits, landowners may also be converting forest to pasture as a form of land speculation and in order to secure their land tenure and also for other social and cultural reasons. Next slide. Finally, we have results for cocoa using global cocoa agriculture maps. We found that 3.1 million hectares of forest were replaced by cocoa globally from 2001 to 2018, with a spike in deforestation in 2014, as well as 2016 to 2018. Indonesia and Cote d'Ivoire had the most forest replacement by cocoa at 23% of the total each, followed by Brazil at 17% and Ghana at 11%. And while West African countries did not have the most forest replacement by cocoa, it does represent a much larger share of their total forest loss. So 1/3 in Ghana and just over 1/4 in Cote d'Ivoire. Next slide. So with that, I'll just say, again, this is just a sample of our full results. The rest of our analysis includes some additional commodities, production information, additional details, and of course, lots of references to the literature, because we're well aware that there are many other groups doing this type of work in different geographies and at different scales. And so with that, I think there will be some additional details about next steps and how to share feedback with us on this work, but otherwise we look forward to taking your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz and Michaela, very much. Just as this slide indicates, I want to say, first of all, please put any questions you have for the WRI team or any comments into the question and answer box. And we will have an opportunity in a few minutes after a couple other speakers to pose any questions you have to them. Also, this work will be published in June or July. And in that time frame, we will hold a TFA video opportunity for a deeper dive into this data and more discussion of it. So we think it's very important that this work be understood and stress tested, if you will, by the larger community. It's a really important part of setting the stage for what needs to come in the next decade. So this is not the last. This is really just a teaser, if you will, of the great work that WRI has been doing to get us to this point. With that, I want to turn our speaking role over to Justin Adams, the director of the Tropical Forest Alliance. Justin.
Thank you, John, and thank you again to everybody for joining. I think at a really important time for the community, and despite COVID, these topics are still going to remain important, and I think it's really important that we continue to be looking at how we can come together as a community virtually over the next few months, so that when the green stimulus comes, when the opportunity to sort of come back together physically is, that we've actually made some real advance on the work we're doing. So I want to just lay out a few thoughts in terms of where this collective action agenda has come from. And it's really about an emerging theory of change, a shift from where we've been in the 2010s, the last decade, which has been a lot about sort of the focus on the companies and a lot of pressure on the leading companies to reduce the deforestation in their own supply chains. Companies who've made commitments, and we want to hold them to account for those commitments. But where we're also seeing some of the limits of that, and I worry we see some diminishing returns if we just keep on that one theory of change. And so where we see, and where we've been in lots of discussions with many of you on this call, is how do we actually both accelerate action by working with the leaders and pushing the leaders to do more, but find where are the additional leverage points in this whole complex system that we recognize we're working in to actually bring about more transformational progress as a whole. And that's really at the heart of what we believe TFA's greatest role is to bring everybody together to look at where we can make more progress together versus what individual companies and individual actors can do on their own. And so if we move to the next slide, please. And so it's been developed by the TFA. And when I say the TFA, this has been by the whole community. So I want to thank many folk on this call and others from the private sector, from civil society, and from our government partners who've been working with us to really look at how we create an action agenda that can help move this whole process forward and help catalyze a more forest positive future. And that's really at the heart of what we believe we can and must commit to collectively to move forward. So this is an invitation to everybody to see how you can engage in this action. You're all doing work on this agenda already, whether it's in your own supply chain, whether it's through your campaigning and advocacy work, whether it's through the policies and regulations that you're working to set, but to look at how all of those pieces fit together to see how we can achieve more together. And that's really what this is an invitation, and TFA is simply the catalyst to try and bring that collective action and that collective spirit together. So the framework is really very simple, and we're going to just go through it and sort of build it up. But at the heart of everything we're talking about is a landscape. And in that landscape, there is forest that we care about and forest that we want to conserve. There are also communities, and community rights and indigenous peoples are clearly important parts of many of the landscapes in which we're focused. And there is also production occurring, which is an economic driver. And that production is creating meaningful employment, it's creating meaningful work for smallholders and for bigger producers. But these are the actors in the landscape, and it's often these actors that we fail to bring into the middle of this discussion. But in any of the discussions we're having, then I think it's important we all recognize the landscape's the starting point. Then, crucially, is the commodity supply chains of which we're talking about, whether it's palm oil, whether it's soybeans, whether it's cattle. And that is then the group of traders and processors. It's the manufacturers and retailers that make up the Consumer Goods Forum, or many of whom are in the Consumer Goods Forum, and then the consumers themselves, you and I. And so private sector action is still at the very heart of what TFA is focused on, and looking at how these interactions around the supply chain and up and down the supply chain are going to work. And also, it's worth saying that too often we're seeing polarization between different parts of this supply chain. You know, the producers feeling if they're being left out, and this is so much of the dynamic we see in Brazil today, if the producers are left out, can we actually come up with meaningful transformation in these landscapes that we care about? So how do we recognize that this whole supply chain is connected to a landscape and that we need a holistic solution around that? And then we've got 4 groups of enablers. So the first of those is clearly in the producer country, the forest country themselves. The action that's occurring there is critical because it's the environment in which companies and smallholders and communities are working and driven, both at the national level as well as then at jurisdictional level. And there's lots of great work going on at the jurisdictional level, at the landscape level. We'll hear a little bit more about that today, but that is clearly one node of action. But also, how do we work and shape the national policies in which all of these supply chains and all of this production activity is occurring? The next group of enablers then is around demand side interventions and demand side countries. And there's lots and lots of activity, there's lots and lots of energy right now, particularly around the European Union and what's occurring around how the EU is looking to regulate imported deforestation. And you see individual member countries like France already acting. The UK has just published a great piece of work called the Global Resource Initiative that will be a key part of what they're looking to do for COP26. So you're seeing more and more country, and indeed the stuff happening in the US. There's more and more action at the demand side level, and how can that complement it? We can't think of it as a silver bullet, because it itself, its action will have another reaction in this broader system we're working if we're not cognizant of how it fits into this broader system. And clearly all of this also occurs where China has become an enormously important, perhaps the most important part of the demand equation here, and where there is growing awareness, there is growing engagement. Actually, just yesterday, the World Economic Forum was hosting a China Business Roundtable, and we had a great session, including with the Ministry of Commerce from China, around how we can think about green value chains in the China context. So China's engagement here is crucial. Other countries like India, like Indonesia, Brazil themselves are super important markets that we also need to be recognizing, create context here. The next set of enablers is then around civil society action, and that's both in terms of targeted campaigning and advocacy. We're also interested in how civil society can bring more sort of some positive voices as well. And then the critical role of transparency and accountability. If companies are making clear commitments, and that's, I think, a lot of what we'll see going forward is much clearer definition of what companies are committing to, how do we hold them accountable to that? And there's, of course, been lots of great work around the accountability framework. There's been lots of other activities and initiatives. The last set of enablers is then really around the finance sector. And the finance sector is both about how we can increase incentives to do more sustainable agriculture, increase green finance, and how can we potentially restrict what we're calling brown finance, but stop the money flowing into key actors that are driving deforestation. So that's the agenda. It's not, it's complex in terms of sort of how all of these pieces fit together, but we hope it's a framework that actually can start to show these pieces and where and how people might connect. If you go to the next slide, please, then we have launched a website, and in that you will see more detail. I'm not going to talk through this now, but there's just an example of some of the demand side measures that have started to be built out on the website. And the next slide, if you go to tropicalforestalliance.org, you will see just today, then that now is a live, that's now live on the website for you to go and click on to start to see how this comes alive in a digital format. And the intention, I should say, as I finish here, is that this becomes a living document. It's not sort of some big fat paper document that's going to sit on the shelf, but it becomes a digital repository for how the community can start talking about the different actions they're taking, that we can then go to, point to, and start to update that over time. So please go to that site, give us some feedback, and see how we can all engage with this as a tool to think about the actions that are going to move forward. So with that, John, I'll hand over to an important update now from the CGF.
Thank you. Thank you, Justin. And let me just say, I'll have a few words at the end of the webinar about next steps and how to specifically engage with the platform, as Justin just said. Our next speakers, Peter Friedman from the Consumer Goods Forum and Jonathan Harrell from Mondelez, are going to address what is, as Justin said, really at the core of the collective action agenda, which is private sector activity to remove deforestation from commodity supply chains. And the Consumer Goods Forum has been at the heart of a lot of this work. We'll also, in this section, hear from Wei Peng from COFCO International from a trader perspective. So we're starting with the private sector because that's really the part of the overall CAA framework that all of those enablers are intended to support and catalyze. So with that, Peter, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, John, and hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be with you. I'm going to talk just a little bit about the two aspects of the transformation that Justin mentioned. One is about how we drive collective action, and the other is about specifically our approach to deforestation. If we can go to the next slide, maybe. I think most of you know the Consumer Goods Forum, but briefly, we represent most of the world's leading manufacturers and retailers, a lot of service providers as well. But that's kind of our role, really at the center of that supply chain that Justin was talking about. So if I start with the first bit of transformation, if you like, which is about the way we drive change, we've learned a lot of lessons from the past, and these lessons we're applying across all of our agenda of positive change, not just on the issue of deforestation. I wanted to cover it because I think it's very relevant to deforestation. 4 aspects I think we'd probably all agree are critical to driving collective action: impact, clear purpose, transformative activities, and obviously action at the end of it. And what we're launching over really the first part of 2020 is a new approach, which we're calling coalitions of action, which try to target each of these 4 levers. So when we talk about impact, you'll see us talking much more about measurement of that impact. On purpose, we are, with these coalitions, each individual coalition, and deforestation will be one coalition, is going to have a very clear purpose. And behind that purpose is something we're calling a charter. And the charter of the coalition of action describes very clearly what it is a group of companies are going to try to achieve and be held accountable for, hold themselves accountable for. All of our coalitions also focus on the more systemic transformations. So engagement, obviously in this case, through the TFA with the wider community is really critical to us. And the last thing is about action. So all of our coalitions are focusing on what we're calling roadmaps, very simple and relatively short-term action plans that Jonathan Horrell is going to talk a little bit more about in a second. So that's this transformative approach to driving change in supply chains. It applies to plastic waste, it applies to forced labor, but it also applies here to deforestation. So we can go to the next slide, please. So on deforestation, we have got a title for our coalition. It's called the Forest Positive Coalition. You'll be glad to hear. So that's the name of the coalition. It has a charter. And the key thing about this charter, which expresses the purpose of reducing commodity-driven deforestation and eliminating it, is that this charter has been signed and supported by a bunch of chief executives. Initially, a relatively tight group of companies. We hope that will expand. If you can go to the next slide. This is the group of companies that have signed up, the CEOs, the chief executives of these 17 companies, manufacturers and retailers, have signed up to this charter on Forest Positive. This is a big change from the way that we used to work in the past. It's very clear commitments from these individual companies. So we can go to the next slide, please. So this is, in summary, what the charter is going to do. Fairly straightforward, I hope, but you'll see there reference to engaging particularly the wider supply chain and the traders in our efforts to remove commodity-driven deforestation. Next slide, please. So I think the key thing we want to talk about here is that we built our plan of action and our roadmaps based on learning from what worked and what didn't work in the past. We know that certification has a value, but the problem with certification is it forces segmentation of supply chains, and good practices happen in one segmented part of the supply chain and not good practices happen in the other part. So certification, we're very clear, is not sufficient. We recognize, however, we have to get our own house in order first, and the 17 companies in the coalition are very clear about that. They need to sort out their own supply chains. But critically, this coalition is going to work with the rest of the supply chain and encourage traders, other producers and suppliers to follow suit. So that's the context, very different approach to driving collective action, a very clear charter focusing on eliminating commodity-driven deforestation. 17 companies signed up by the CEO. Now I'm going to hand over to Jonathan, who'll talk a little bit more about what those roadmaps really comprise.
Hi, this is Jonathan. So first of all, I'm just going to check that I can be heard.
You're good, Jonathan.
Oh, that's great. Okay, so I expect this to be the first and the last time that I have Peter as my warm-up act, but thank you, Peter, very much for that strategic overview. It was crystal clear. So my job is to explain the actions that we've been taking through CGF's commodity-specific groups in parallel with work to set up the overall coalition. By June, we're developing roadmaps for palm oil, soy, and pulp, paper and packaging. The roadmaps aim to drive real change, to build on the coalition's theory of change by acting both within and beyond supply chains, with elements included to address each, and also to ensure transparency. It's important to note as well that CGF also has a human rights coalition of action, so we'll be collaborating with that group to align actions wherever this is useful. I'm leading the palm oil group, and now we'll take a look at the palm oil roadmap in a bit more detail on the next chart. So the plan builds very deliberately on the theory of change in ways that are relevant specifically to conditions in the palm oil sector. It has 5 key elements that you see summarized to the left. The first 3 relate to the first element of the theory of change, supply chain management. First, companies in the coalition will continue to step up efforts to eliminate deforestation in their own supply chains. And I don't need to say how keenly we each feel that accountability in 2020. At the same time, we recognize that the consumer goods sector is just part of the demand for palm oil overall, and that transformation must reach the entire sector. So we'll be working closely with the trader refiners who place oil on the international market and also trade with the upstream growers, with each coalition member committing to engage traders to implement no deforestation across their entire palm oil operations. At Mondelez, we've seen real progress by implementing our own palm oil plan on these terms. And now as a coalition, we need to bring this home to help eliminate deforestation across the sector as a whole. And the third element is actively to monitor the production base. Currently, there are a number of sources of satellite concession monitoring information, and the proposed commitments are to ensure that the best information is available in a consistent way to all coalition members and their suppliers, and that coalition members have mechanisms in place to respond proactively to grievances when they occur. Turning now to integrated land use, the second element on the right-hand side of the theory of change that you see summarized in the top left. The palm oil sector extends, of course, into the wider landscape well beyond the large-scale concessions that are operated by the plantation sector. So it's necessary for coalition members to work collaboratively with other actors to support forest conservation and restoration, with positive outcomes for local communities. Of course, we'll do this in close collaboration with the TFA and TFA partner organizations that are already working on landscape engagement, and I expect this topic will appear later on the agenda as well. The final aspect will be to provide transparency by reporting against KPIs for each element, aligned as far as possible with recognized frameworks. Overall, each part of the plan sets out specific commitments, individual and collective actions, and transparency requirements to provide accountability. Finally, I want to emphasize that we're keen to understand stakeholder perspectives and inputs. We will consult directly with key stakeholders during the coming weeks on the palm plan, with the other commodities to follow. If you wish to share inputs, please reach out via the TFA Secretariat. I'm looking forward to receiving many points of view and rich input to help us improve coalition plans to achieve a forest positive future. Okay, final chart, please. And you can learn more at CGF's own website with the address on screen now. With that, I hand back to John. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter and Jonathan, very much. Very, very helpful. And again, let me encourage participants in the webinar to enter any questions or comments or guidance in the Q&A. We'll respond to some of those here in a few minutes when we have an opportunity. Otherwise, we will make sure that those questions are responded to either by CGF colleagues or through TFA. With that, I would like to ask Wei Peng from COFCO International to share some perspectives from a trader view in some of the specific actions that they're looking to build on that will feed into the CAA in the coming months. Wei?
Thank you very much, John. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss some of our initiatives and our collective work. First of all, I'd like to say that the CAA framework is a great a way to visualize the different enablers needed to advance the deforestation-free agenda, and then for each stakeholder to have a clear view of where their biggest contributions might lie. As a trading company, COFCO International, we are in the commodity trading of a range of commodities, including soy, grains, coffee, cotton, and palm oil. And many of them are within the scope of the CAA framework. So in addition to individual company initiatives, we have reviewed the framework and then identified a few particular areas where we feel as a company we have leverage and we need to focus on to advance collective actions. Here I would like to give one or two examples on that. First of all is the jurisdictional action. As I mentioned, we are a big trader of soybean, and Mato Grosso is an important region for origination for us as a company. So there we have been quite actively involved in the PCI initiative of the Mato Grosso state, where we have had extensive interactions with the stakeholders, from the state government to producer groups, to the local civil society NGOs and producers, also with our peers as well. So this, I think, is a very promising initiative to advance the local agenda and find local solutions. Another example is a project that we are starting in the Matopiba area as part of the Soft Commodities Forum initiative, where we have prioritized 25 municipalities in the Matopiba region, where the risk of deforestation is and land conversion remains the highest. And then we have identified a local partner to conduct a further understanding of the land conversion challenges, to engage with the producers directly, to understand their perspective and what is needed for them to change their plan of land conversion and to maintain the forest standing. I think these are collective actions are very promising to find localized solutions with the local partners. And I think that these kind of initiatives fall very well into the CAA framework, and we'd encourage more partners to join and to participate to advance the agenda together. Another area where, as COFCO International, we feel we can make a bigger contribution is on the demand side, country action. As a company with a Chinese government background, we feel the responsibility and the opportunity that we have to further engage more Chinese stakeholders, including Chinese peers in this sector, to first of all join the discussions and to raise the awareness and to take actions as a follow-up. As Justin mentioned yesterday, there was the China Business Coalition webinar. It was well participated by a wide range of Chinese stakeholders, and also a lot of already good progress was highlighted among the Chinese sectors. For example, there is the update on the palm oil sector collective actions, and another example of the Chinese real estate sector, of how they have advanced green pulp and paper and green timber initiatives. I think the Chinese community of TFA has created a great platform to have more exchanges, to engage with also the Chinese government, to engage with the Chinese civil society, including the local NGOs and the Chinese business sector. I remain very positive, and we think we can play a bigger role to engage and to encourage participation of more Chinese stakeholders. So I'll stop there and see if there are any questions. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Wei. Very, very helpful and very specific. So I think that gives good examples of the kinds of actions that we're hoping all will engage in to support this important work. We've gotten a number of good questions into the question box, and I want to pose some of those in a second. I also, before I do that, I want to see if our colleague can put up his work in terms of his recording of the discussion to this point. And while he's doing that, let me pose a question for Jonathan Harrell. Jonathan, who will be using the roadmap? How do you see the roadmap on palm oil as an example of one of the roadmaps kind of working its way through the system? You mentioned that you're going to be encouraging suppliers and others to engage, but can you say a bit more about how CGF sees that kind of radiating through the system, if you will?
Yeah, great. So the purpose of the coalition, of the roadmap, is to inform the commitments and actions and accountability for the companies specifically that are members of the coalition. And so you saw that list of 17 companies during Peter's charts. And so the roadmap is for us, but it's also for the community to help us shape and continue to improve as we move forward. And within that group, we are talking already about the actions that we take to deliver against the high-level commitments and actions that we spell out in the plan. So we'll simply be working together to implement, obviously, the collective elements of that plan. We'll be working individually on our own supply chains, and we'll be working individually with commitments that we make to engage each of us as individual customers, our trader suppliers in our upstream supply chain. We'll be working collectively to work to get the best monitoring outputs to get them more consistent and better shared across the sector so that we can understand the highest priority areas and cases that we need to work on. And then beyond that, when we move into landscapes, we need to work with other parts of the TFA community, both in terms of the organizations bringing together initiatives in the broader landscape, and we all know the examples of some of those, and critically, of course, the governments in producer areas. It's a bit like what's happening in cocoa at the moment in the broader landscape, where we have the Cocoa and Forest Initiative, and you might have seen reports from that, coming out over the past week or so, where the chocolate and cocoa companies are working with stakeholders and critically the governments of the two largest producer countries to work together to understand how to manage and protect the forest better. So with the landscape elements of the work, this will very much be collaborative action, and the plan guides how the companies will engage in that.
Very good. Thank you, Jonathan. We've gotten several comments and questions about cattle and how cattle are going to be handled in the context of similar activities to what's being outlined in the roadmap. And I know that the CGF is not specifically looking at cattle, given the kind of priority interests and business focus of those companies. But Justin, I know TFA has given some thought to working on the cattle issue, because obviously it's a major driver of deforestation, as our WI colleagues pointed out. Do you want to say a word about that?
Yeah, a couple of points and some really good questions in the Q&A. I mean, as the WRI data shows, and one of the reasons we were really keen to be working with WRI on this data is just to try and quantify the different levels that different commodities were responsible for in driving it. So we've talked about 40%. Some people sort of use higher numbers of deforestation occurring because of commodities. Well, how much of this is that? And then you sort of look at the data that WRI is breaking down, even up to 2015, where there's real confidence on that data, and you see quite what a big and significant share of that is cattle, and clearly so much of that is in Latin America. It's I think one of the big looming questions that we have as a community that we really need to reflect on. How do we do that? Because I'd say overall, it's been the commodity that we've all failed to make the most progress on. So that's the first point. The second point would be that there's questions around why is CGF not prioritizing that? And we've spent a lot of time talking to the CGF and the CGF companies, and the amount of exposure they have to Latin America beef on the whole is very limited. There are some retailers who have significant retail presence in Latin America, and there are some discussions around what they might do together that are early. But in terms of a global alliance, as the CGF is, as Peter outlined, many of those companies have got very, very limited exposure to that. And as I think many people on this call know, 80% of beef production in Brazil is consumed domestically, right? So how and where do we find ways of mobilizing more action to address that, I think is a real question. I know others on this call have also been looking at leather, right? And how the leather consumers or manufacturers could actually be another lever for sort of motivating more change there. But I think collectively as a whole, we really do need to take a step back and look what can be done. There are some initiatives, there are some roundtables, but we're not doing enough collectively, but it's not going to be the CGF as a whole that stands up a separate coalition on beef or on cattle for us to drive this. So, you know, really interested to work with many of you around what we could do to catalyze more collective action around the cattle, given how important it is. And it then takes me to the third point, which is we also know, and this has also been some of the exchange on the Q&A, that much of that is driven through illegal action versus legal action. So some of the actors, some of the big meat packers in Latin America are doing a lot. Are they perfect? Are they doing as much as we need? I'm sure the answer is no. But JBS has just joined the TFA and are engaging more and more in the Brazil with the Brazil team for TFA now. They've got their reasons for doing that, and again, I'm sure that lots of people still want to critique what they're doing, but they've also done quite a lot. So how can we as TFA want to bring them in and see how we can work with them to do more? But one of the big questions they're asking us is, you know, much of what's happening is the illegality. So how can we work together on the illegality piece, where so many of the levers that TFA is focused on are with the legitimate corporate actors, are with governments, are with civil society players? How can we again address more of that illegality? So there may not be a satisfactory answer there, but one, we know cattle is a huge problem. Two, CGF is not going to be the group that puts together a new cattle coalition, but what is that going to look like? And thirdly, how are we going to address illegality? We haven't got answers to all of that, but would love to think about a separate little virtual session we could put together to brainstorm how we could work together over the next few months to do more and to do more together.
Thank you, Justin. Let me just note there's some good comments coming in about the definition of forest positive future. How does restoration fit into that? Etc. I'm going to suggest we move on. Some of our upcoming speakers might address that a bit, and then we can come back to that issue when we have our second Q&A session. Let me also thank Matthias for his good work in the visual you saw, and we'll have another opportunity to look at that in the final session and ask him to say a word about what he's seen, heard, and been capturing there. But I want to. So please keep the questions and comments coming. They're excellent. And some of these the team is going to respond to in writing in real time. So you may be getting some responses that you'll be seeing as we go forward that we won't have time to verbalize on the call, but please keep that going. Very helpful. I want to turn now to Dr. Susan Crone of the government of Germany to say a few words from their perspective. They are a TFA supporting donor and of course extremely active and engaged in this space. Susan?
Yes, thank you, John. Good afternoon to everyone from Berlin. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. Let me start by explaining briefly why Germany joined the Tropical Forest Alliance last year. We did so because we see it as a unique opportunity to work together with different stakeholders on the big task to combat deforestation. We all know that deforestation is a very complex issue and that there is no silver bullet to solve all problems, and that there is no single actor to solve the problems either. And for that very reason, we thought it would be a good idea to join forces with different actors to bring the agenda forward, because in order to be transformative, we have to join forces and act collectively and in collaboration. I am a climate finance person and I work in the Ministry of Environment, so I'm pretty much used to work in state-centered settings. But it's clear to me, as it is to many other colleagues of my institution, that we need a broader sphere and that we need to join forces with other actors as well. May it be companies, may it be NGOs, may it be international institutions. And the collective action agenda of the Tropical Forest Alliance gives us this opportunity to work together. This as a starting point, I would now like to focus on specific areas where we think we can contribute to the collective action agenda and where we also think that maybe the collective action agenda could profit from our work. One area that is very important to us is the area to find additional leverage points I think this is a very important issue, and we think a lot can be done also in collaboration with the finance sector. You're all aware of the fact that we have a movement around the world to divest from fossil fuels. We have not seen something equivalent yet on the issue of deforestation. So one area where we think we could center collaboration around is to discuss defund measures for deforestation. This is an issue that's very important to us from the government side. And to be more specific on what we do, we also try to help developing instruments that can bring together the public and the private sector in financing forest activities that are in line with our objective. And let me just mention one. We're currently working together with UNEP and the government of Luxembourg on a finance vehicle that blends public and private sources. And it does so for allowing to provide resources for forest landscape restoration. And the fund works in the sense that it helps investment managers to build up pipelines and to establish concrete ideas for project proposals that could then be financed. This is a very specific idea. Now let me, at the end, move to the more political level. Germany will take over the EU presidency in the Council in the second half of 2020. And we will hope that we can use this opportunity to push forward on the aspect of deforestation-free supply chains. We would like to work together more closely with producer countries and important consumers on the issue and use our presidency for that. We know that TFA is an important partner for us in this because it can help us to bring different actors to the table and create a setting where we can have fruitful discussions and see how we can proceed forward in this respect. When I looked at the webinar agenda, I was very happy to see that my colleague Ivan from Colombia is also participating, because we are working closely together with Norway and the UK and Colombia on protecting the forests in Colombia. And with these words, I would like to hand over to him, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Susan. Yvonne, would you like to share perspectives from the government of Colombia? You're on mute, Yvonne. Sorry. There you go.
Hello. Good morning or afternoon to all of you. Yes, and thanks for inviting me to this webinar. Thanks, Susan, for the mention of your support. Your support, as well as other donor countries, is very important and has helped us develop this agenda. So I just wanted to share with the audience some of our thoughts as a government on how we see this collective action in the context of our country. We have taken to heart this concept of collective action to remove deforestation associated with supply chains. We did join TFA back in 2017, and we soon formed a national TFA alliance called the TFA Colombia Alliance, and to basically bring these discussions to a national context and a national level. In our country, we have a situation where a lot of the commodities are mostly consumed at the national level. So we have to create the awareness in the national market. We cannot rely solely on the international market. We did prioritize 4 supply chains to start working on this, and created voluntary agreements. This is palm oil, cocoa, beef, and dairy. We wanted to divide beef and dairy given the segmentation of these 2 products in the market, and actually quite different impacts in different parts of the country. We also, on the regulatory front, as you know, we came out of a outcome there was to establish an agricultural frontier, basically the limit where agriculture to be protected. And this was quite, we developed a regulation establishing this agricultural frontier, and this has become our basically the line of action because we have a lot of underutilized culture, and we have to redirect all our efforts to promote agriculture there and not to allow it in beyond this agricultural frontier. I wanted to share with you some of our thoughts on the voluntary agreements and why this is a collective action. These agreements involve private sector, involve companies, involve the guilds of these commodities, involve the government and civil society. We have mainstream. We have agreed definitions of zero deforestation across all these commodities. We want to take this to the consumer. So far, we still have a long way to go in educating the consumer at the national level and to make this relevant to the national consumers. And we have found that one of our biggest hurdles is traceability of commodities, and how do you actually document the provenance, the origin of commodities to the market, and how do you show that to the consumer? And this is a hurdle for all the actors, and we're working on each of them to work through this. And fortunately, there is a voluntary and public political will to remake the cattle traceability system, for instance, which is one of our main commodity that affects deforestation. On the other hand, we want to use this as a way to distinguish commodities in the international market in our context, like palm oil and cocoa, where in our country we don't have a lot of impacts from deforestation on these two. And we have, for instance, recently came out a study that we produced showing that from only 1.5% of deforestation at the national level was associated with palm oil, and only 2% of new crops of palm oil since 2010 had some deforestation footprint. And with this data, we hope to position our national palm oil in the international market. Just to finish, I wanted to share with you some challenges and lessons. One is that how do we share the burden of sustainable production? We cannot just put the burden on the producers, not on the consumers with higher prices. So we have to all share the burden, the government with information, transparency, regulation, the traders and the companies as well, and also the finance sector, so that it's more equitably shared and not overburdening one sector. We have to, as Colombia, we have to view ourselves not only as producer country, but also as a consumer country in the different roles. Traceability, we need to resolve that. And we have to combat illegality, which is a big issue, and we have to deal with it as well. Thank you. So these were the lessons I wanted to share with you.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you both very, very much. And again, please, participants, if you have questions or comments for either Dr. Crone or Yvonne, please include them in the box, and we'll try to get back to them in our second question and answer period, and pose those to them, or that perhaps they can respond directly through the Q&A. I'd like to turn next to the enabler area of civil society action. And we have two speakers who will share their thoughts, John Buchanan from Conservation International and Gita Sirani from LTKL in Indonesia. And John, let me turn it over to you for your contribution.
Great, thank you, John. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Wonderful. Great. So thanks to TFA, and thanks for everyone for joining today. Just to say a few quick words, and for those that may not know Conservation International, we're a nonprofit organization that works in about 25 countries around the world to conserve nature for the benefit of people. And the one thing that we all know, everyone on this call today knows, that if we only focus on conservation and sustainable management of natural areas, we will not achieve lasting conservation outcomes. We all know now that we must consider economic needs in these areas through sustainable and equitable production systems. We know we need the right governance systems in place. We know we need the finance and the market access to drive solutions at scale. And of course, all those issues are interconnected and they're complex and not easy to figure out how to move those together collectively. And so while we know there's been many great initiatives that have developed and taken off over the past decade or so, those are not yet happening at the scale or the speed and pace at which we need to avoid the worst effects of climate change. And we know that climate change is not going to work for us to figure out, going to wait for us to figure out how we work together better. And so I think one of the values of the collective action agenda and what makes us excited is how it helps us understand how to learn from those initiatives that have developed so far, and how do we capture some of those lessons and think about how do we better coordinate and collaborate between the different sectors, the different stakeholders to drive greater impact working together. And I think the other thing, by helping us think about the different actions needed, the different solutions and stakeholders that need to be part of these initiatives and part of these solutions, I think it also sends us a really important reminder to all of us that we need to think about how are we framing the problems we are trying to solve, and are we framing those in a way that key stakeholders can see themselves in the solutions. And this is why I really like the idea of the forest positive future, because if we are only framing the challenges that we're trying to solve around stopping deforestation, and we're ignoring the economic needs and aspirations of the millions that produce these crops, we are likely alienating some of the key stakeholders that we need to have on board working with us collectively to solve these problems and have lasting solutions at scale. So the last point I would make about the collective action agenda is that it's really important that we are clear that it is not an excuse for letting companies delay commitments or letting them off the hook, but really helping us channel and direct those commitments and investments so that they can better align with the efforts of other stakeholders and hopefully have greater impact. And so, I welcomed Jonathan's comments and the palm oil action plan from earlier, because it's very clear that we need greater commitment, action, and investment by all members of these value chains, up and down the value chains, if we're going to have the impact that we need to see at scale. And so very quickly, just to turn to one example where CI, Conservation International, is working with many of you on this call to put some of these ideas and the concept of collective action into practice, is in Indonesia, in the Coalition for Sustainable Livelihoods in North Sumatra and Aceh. And the Coalition for Sustainable Livelihoods is a place-based platform that is focused on bringing together government, private sector, civil society to identify common interests and goals, to jointly develop plans to advance towards those goals, and to work collectively on their implementation. The Coalition for Sustainable Livelihoods works at both at landscape and district levels, and also at provincial and supply chain levels, because we're trying to work at those multiple scales in a coordinated fashion. In North Sumatra, the work is building on and working to support implementation of the government of Indonesia's National Action Plan for Sustainable Palm Oil, working with several different parts of government and building on the work that Conservation International and UNDP have done to advance the FOXP platform and the National Action Plan. And in Aceh, the work of the coalition builds on what Earthworm Foundation and IDH have been doing, and the Verified Sourcing Area Initiative. And so in addition to driving this alignment between these different sectors, the coalition is trying to create that connectivity and cooperation between the different sectors, transparency, so that we can identify what needs to happen, what are the gaps, hold ourselves accountable, and bring a lot of these global aspirations down to focus and make them real in specific places. So thanks again for the time. We are encouraged by the progress so far and would welcome others to join us in the coalition.
Thank you very much, John, and a great, I think, stage setting and segue to Gita, who is, of course, has worked many years in Indonesia on these issues at the district level as well as the national level. Gita, would you like to share your thoughts, please?
Hi, everyone. Thanks, John, both John. Can you hear me clearly?
Yeah, you could be a little louder, so get a little closer to your mic, but you're good.
All right. So yeah, thanks everyone. And that's a very good segue coming from John. So a bit of introduction of LTKL, or Lingkar Temu Kabupaten Lestari. The English translation would be Sustainable Districts Association. So it's literally an association of district government that are focusing on how to better implement sustainable concept through jurisdictional approach. In a way, the reason why the coalition exists is also because this opportunity that's provided by the global players such as TFA. So first of all, we think that the collective action would be very helpful for the journey forward. But we also understand that in order to upscale all of the global practice, we do need some clarity on the ground on how to best implement that and how everybody can actually take part within the scenario. And right now, a lot of the answers are still vague. So what LTKL Secretariat is trying to do is actually help answer some of that questions. Essentially, we focus on jurisdictional approach because we want to help settle some issues that can not be solved by any other actors aside from the government. So things like legality, governance, how do you benchmark success on the ground, what type of data can you use, how do you monitor those type of data so that everybody are happy with the results. Those type of questions we're trying to answer those. But right now we're actually focusing much more on 3 prongs. So first is governance. The second one is how to create value proposition for each actors that is involved within the scenario, and the third is actually benchmarking and reporting. And just some highlights from the ground on those 3 prongs. John mentioned Aceh Tamiang as one of the coalition member. We're actually working with IDH in 2 locations, Aceh and Musi Banyu Asin. And in both locations, what we're trying to do is actually help build a governance system that is adhering to this criteria of accountable party for sustainable commodities production, but also answering to the needs to have a multi-stakeholders characteristic. How do we combine that? The 2 district government that right now are trialing it out through a concept called Center of Agricultural Excellence, in which that can be fashioned like a legal entity with accountability element as well. But during the decision making, it can involve multi-stakeholders parties. So fingers crossed, we're coordinating with RSPO jurisdictional working group, as well as the VSA Global Steering Committee and other partners, whether we're actually building the right stuff or not on the ground. The second one is on the value proposition itself. What we're concentrating mostly is to help district government. The Germany government mentioned the need to have good portfolio. So that's essentially what we're trying to help the district to come up with. Portfolio that answers the need of the incentives provider in a way, whether it's private sector or public sector, investors, trader, you name it. We try to make a good packages, different packages, so that jurisdictions with sustainable commodities production can access multiple doors, not only limited to one. And in a way that have come up, lead us to a conclusion that we should also enlarge commodities diversification. So not only working on palm and rubber, but also looking at things like non-timber forest products, spices, coconut, different things that are very close to people's heart. And the third component on the benchmarking, we just finished our regional competitiveness report. It's up for anybody to download from our website. And that actually differentiate main indicators coming up from compliance, but also from market demand, including the VSA, the RSPO-PNC, the Sustainable Landscape Rating Tools, an EU Commission effort called Terpercaya, and also we're collaborating with Landscale and CSL Coalition. So hopefully with this benchmarking exercise, we can make it easier for jurisdictions to understand what is it that they have to measure, how can they measure it, and what type of database should they store it on so that's publicly accessible. And in a way, what we found out just now, actually at end of February, we trial it in 3 locations, in Siak, Sintang, and Gorontalo, and found out that out of the 18 indicators, there's only 40% that they can fill in. So it's up to us to figure out how to fill in the rest together.
Thank you very much, both of you. Excellent information for everyone to digest, and I think great examples of the kind of actions that tie the various actors together into collective action. So thank you. I want to turn now to Petra Tanos from the Tropical Forest Alliance, who's going to say a few words about what TFA's priorities and actions will be in support of the collective action agenda, and then we'll have an opportunity to respond to some of the good questions. So please keep your comments and questions coming into the box. Petra?
Great, thanks so much, John. And so, you know, we've heard great presentations from a number of TFA partners, CGF and others, about what collective action means to them and what they'll be doing. What I'm sure many of you are on the line are wondering is, what is TFA's role in all of this, and what are we going to do to accelerate impact for this community? So if you could go to the next slide, thanks. I'd like to just talk you through the 5 areas that we think are a real priority for TFA. And that means TFA, the Secretariat, but of course TFA and the broader community. And the first is to motivate the CGF Coalition and other private sector actors to increase their ambition and to deliver concrete action. Companies know that they need to do more, and as you've heard on this call, they're really stepping up action. And what we'd like to really do is to galvanize the TFA partnership to support them, and to build bridges along the supply chain and between all of the various emerging initiatives and platforms that are focused on specific parts of the supply chain or on specific individual commodities. You know, we have things like the Action for Sustainable Derivatives, the Palm Oil Transparency Coalition, the Soft Commodities Forum, OP2B, the Alliance for the Conservation of Tropical Forests. So lots of platforms and initiatives that are out there, lots of coalitions and groups of ambitious companies. And what TFA can really do is to build bridges between that, to make sure there's good synergy and that these platforms and forums are working well together. Another key part of this is holding the private sector to account. Progress only counts when we can see it and we can measure it. And what TFA is going to prioritize is making sure that there's very strong bridges built between the companies and the coalitions and those TFA partners that are working specifically to monitor the progress of and implementation of company commitments. A second area is I think, answers specifically one of the questions that came through to us around how the collective action agenda ties to the CGF roadmap and to private sector action more broadly. And I think this is really one of the biggest contributions that TFA can make, which is to galvanize the partnership more broadly to mobilize private sector action beyond just supply chains. So there's a huge opportunity for companies to go beyond what they've been doing in their own supply chains and to plug into some of the key enablers in the collective action agenda, engaging at jurisdictional scale, addressing demand side measures, collaborating with producer country governments. Some of the things that we're already doing in this space is hosting a series of roundtables to bring the private sector voice and leadership to EU regulations. We've started up a China Business Coalition, and we'll be supporting the CGF and other private sector actors with engaging in jurisdictional approaches with the support of folks that you've heard speaking today and many other TFA partners. A third area is to leverage the World Economic Forum's trusted relationship with governments and producing countries to support more constructive dialogue. For those of you who don't know, the Tropical Forest Alliance is hosted by the World Economic Forum, which is an international organization for public-private collaboration with a very long history in helping governments overcome really polarized situations and helping to broker consensus. And we are going to bring that strength and that experience to this agenda to help really reframe the narrative, to enable constructive dialogue, and more importantly, actually to break through some of the polarization that's there and catalyze action. A fourth piece, this is something that's also come up in several questions on this webinar, is the question of the financial services sector. Obviously, it's a huge part of the collective action agenda. We all understand that without effective engagement of the financial services community, we can't get to where we're trying to go. TFA has done some work in this space, and a number of TFA partners are actively engaging the finance sector. But what we'd like to do in the near term is explore what more TFA can do to accelerate action in this sector. So we'll be doing that in partnership with many of you, and if that's something that you're interested in supporting, please do reach out. And finally, what we're really committed to continuing to do is elevating the forest positive narrative. Progress has happened. Progress, you know, we're all looking forward to more progress happening. And we must continue to motivate that, and communicating and showcasing the successes and the forest positive stories is a key part of what TFA can contribute to this agenda. What's key there is that it's got to be evidence-based progress, which is why I want to really reemphasize the message around the role that we see TFA playing in ensuring accountability and making sure that the private sector is doing what they said they would do. And the progress that we report out is then based on evidence and fact. So these are the 5 areas, you know, and I really want to emphasize that all of this will be made possible with all of you on the call today and many other TFA partners. And we're really excited to be engaging with you on this agenda and partnering with you closely in these 5 areas.
Thank you, Petra, very much.
Thanks.
We now have a few minutes to pose a few questions. Again, the TFA team, Justin et al. Have been responding to a number of the questions in real time, so please take a look at those responses. And as they've indicated, they're more than happy to follow up with more dialogue with a number of you. So these are excellent inputs that are coming in. I wanted to, Yvonne, ask you a question. There was a comment made, question about the role of traceability in the work that you're doing in Colombia. And maybe this relates nicely to what the point Petra just made about accountability and making sure progress is being made in ways we can measure. Do you want to just say a bit more about how traceability and accountability and issues related to tenure and land rights, kind of how do you see those pieces coming together on the ground in the work you've been doing?
Sure. Well, when we involve companies asking them to document where they're sourcing from, particularly beef and dairy, so of course they need to map their suppliers, and there we run into hurdles, particularly for beef, where usually even slaughterhouses don't necessarily ask for the records of the farms that where the beef comes from, or only the first one, the direct suppliers, but not the indirect suppliers, and the chain of custody is lost. So and we have a lot of fragmentation in the traceability system, and therefore the agricultural ministry is revamping it, trying to integrate the different subsystems. And this has been led because of sanitary reasons, because we want to become an export market. We are currently closed. We don't have access to a lot of markets yet. But of course, we at the Ministry of Environment want to get into that discussion and insert environmental variables, parameters into the traceability system, including deforestation. And also, this could also be used to track illegality, because illegality in production of beef in even protected areas, illegal movements or smuggling of cattle, a lot of these things go under the radar because the traceability system is not very, it's very fragmented, and you can't really trace the whole thing. In dairy is somewhat easier, but still we also need to develop a culture of it across the supply chains.
Thank you very much. We're going to, in a moment, we'll put up Matthias's work from this last section and ask him to say a few words about what he's been capturing. Susan, I wanted to ask you a question just quickly about the, you mentioned that obviously the role of Germany as the in the EU presidency. There's a question or two about how you'll be looking at other carbon-rich and deforestation-rich ecosystems beyond tropical forests and the whole context of finance for nature-based solutions, et cetera. Can you just say a word about how you see your work on forests fitting into that broader agenda?
Yeah, well, thank you. Of course, I can do that. It's, of course, only an example for our work on, let's say, at the interface between biodiversity protection and climate protection and finance. As I said earlier, I work in the climate division, so we have a very specific focus on the biodiversity-related climate activities. But it is the case that forestry is not the only one. So for instance, we're trying to establish something similar in the area of peatlands and mangroves, which you can be regarded later as the last one is forestry. But it is, I think, easier for us in the forestry sector because we have these two very clear demands from the climate side and the biodiversity side. And we have a lot of international discussions this year going around these two issues. But we're having more difficulties in developing financial instruments in other areas. So I think forestry is the front runner there, but we are more than open to develop vehicles in other areas if we see potential interest.
Very good, thank you. Do we have, let's go to the next step slide if we could, Seth. So, is that slide? Oh, there we go. Very good. So let me just quickly say a word about next steps so we can end on time here. We'll hopefully be able to see the Matthias work, and then Justin will make some closing comments. So right now, of course, we've been in the process of putting the collective action agenda together, and this webinar is a critical moment to get it out to the broader community. And again, thank you all for your excellent input. And we will be following up on the inputs that have come. And this is just the beginning of a process. We will be going live in the next day or so with a survey that will be sent out to all of you as TFA partners. And we'll be asking you to indicate in that survey in a very explicit way what your intended actions are, similar to those you've heard examples of from our colleagues who have been speaking on this call. So this is not just an opportunity to catalog everything you're doing in the forest arena. This is to focus in on those actions that all the various stakeholders involved in the TFA community are taking to link to these enablers to support and catalyze corporate action to reduce deforestation from commodity supply chains. You've heard that emphasis a lot during this call, and we want to make it clear that we're looking for that as the graphic that Justin went through at the beginning illustrates. So you'll be receiving that, and we'll be curating the responses to that and tracking, and we'll be working with all the partners to fill gaps and accelerate collective progress during this period. Then we will make an assessment as a community with TFA Secretariat leading on what does that look like, where are there gaps, where are there areas where there's not enough going on or synergies are being missed. And we'll be developing modes of measuring progress, as Petra was saying a few minutes ago, so that by the end of the year, we can roll up for all of you the way the picture looks. This is something that did not take place in the previous decade in a coherent way. As Justin said at the beginning, TFA is not controlling this agenda, but sees that in this context of supporting and catalyzing company action, TFA has a role to play, and not just in encouraging you all to act in a collective way, but to assess how that action is making a difference. So that will be part of the overall cycle. We just wanted to highlight that. And I'm thinking that maybe what we should do, given our time, if we can put up Matthias's work here, the last piece that he's done, I want to turn it over to, and he wants to make any quick comments, that would be great. Otherwise, Justin, I think we should turn to you for closing comments.
Yes,
Justin,
I'm Matthias, the graphic recorder, and I was carefully listening to everything that has been said, and so I visualized and put together the main points of everything that has been in the various sections of the webinar. I'm not sure why it's not coming on now. I'll try again.
Well, why don't we go, Matthias? Why don't we go ahead and ask Justin to make some closing comments, and maybe it can come up in the background as he's doing that, because I do want to try to end on schedule. Justin?
Yeah, so I want to firstly thank everybody. There's the beautiful infographic. Thank you so much, Matthias, for doing that. So you're my first thanks, but thank you to John for great moderation of the panel. Thank you to all the speakers and for all the preparation of work. Thank you to the TFA team for all the work, and the Meridian team for the work in preparing it. I think it's a wonderful example of how we can use technology and really continue to engage as a community through these incredibly difficult months that we all have ahead of us. So a thank you to all of them. A thank you to everybody for participating on the call. Great use of Q&A. We've answered many of the questions, and I would encourage you to email me directly or to tfa@weforum.org with additional questions, additional follow-up. And I think in particular, what are some of these key questions that we're going to need to address if we want to move forward to more transformational action? This whole cattle illegality question that was talked about, and how that's going to impede things in terms of where the legal actors are and how we mobilize things, I think is a really important question. So I certainly want to see how we could organize a virtual meeting on that in the next few weeks. I hope this collective action agenda is going to be a useful framework. It will only be a useful framework, though, if people lean in, if people work to document some of what you're doing and how you want to sort of plug into this broader system dynamic that we know is going to be essential to really drive down deforestation in the years ahead. So we're 1 minute over, but a huge thank you to everybody, and a big ask to please continue to engage and see how we can do more together in the weeks and months ahead. And a plea to all of you to please stay safe and look after yourselves, your families, your communities, as we all learn how to exist in a new world. But this agenda is more important than ever. So thank you all, and we look forward to talking very, very soon. Bye-bye.
And the survey I mentioned will be popping up here just as the webinar closes, I've been told. So, but we'll also make sure you've got other ways to access it, and that's the way to really act on what Justin just encouraged you all to do in terms of engagement. So thank you all very much. Be safe.